My name is Joseph Sileo. I'm a senior studying psychology, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the results from my thesis project in the Computational Memory Lab here at Penn. Specifically, I've been looking at the effects of experimentally induced familiarity on human recall of lists of words. So first we need to understand what experimentally induced familiarity means in the context of a memory experiment and why it's important to study. So, experimentally induced familiarity refers to the amount of exposure and repetition to particular words in the context of the experiment, not the commonality of the words themselves. So, what this means is that we're not looking at how often these words appear in the English language as a measure of word frequency. Instead, we're looking at how often the words appear as presented in the experiment themselves. So, how many times was the subject exposed to a particular word in the study sessions of the experiment? This type of familiarity is important because we rarely form representations based on one experience or encounter in our real lives. And representations that we form based on only a few encounters might be different than ones that we have like a high level of repeated exposure to. Do we remember concepts differently if they're based on one encounter as compared to many? The only way to accurately model this in the experiment is to induce that familiarity by providing repeated exposure to some words. It's also important because familiarity has only ever been studied in this sense in large experimental sittings. What I mean by this is that typically in the literature, participants will come in for one session of an experiment with a high number of lists of words, get all the lists done in that one setting, and then they leave and they never come back and do the experiment again. Rather, we split up our experiment into multiple sessions, such that subjects come in for a certain amount of lists of words in different contexts. The time of day they might come in for a session might be different, the amount of sleep they had the night before, their workload that week, whether they had an exam, what the weather is like. All of these are variable, so these factors change and provide even more of a variable context and more information for the subject to draw upon and create the representations. To give you an example of how familiarity and might affect these words, I'll give you the example of your brother Frank and your cousin Nick. Frank will be playing the role of a familiar concept, and Nick will be the novel concept. So you grew up with your brother Frank, and you see him at every holiday and every family gathering. In addition to these current experiences, you've had a lot of experiences with Frank growing up as children, and you have all of these concepts stored. So you have many experiences with Frank in many different contexts. In contrast, cousin Nick lives in another country, and you only see him at occasional large family reunions. So you don't have as much information there, but every time that you see Nick, you have a very distinct memory of what's occurring because you don't have any interference from the other experiences that you've had. So if I asked you to remember the last time that you saw Frank and Nick, what would happen? Would you remember more details about Frank or Nick? How many details would be correct to the last time that you saw them and not any other time you saw them? That's what we're looking at here, but in the context of words, not people. So, for a brief study overview, participants are shown lists of words one item at a time. Always after each list is presented, and sometimes before, participants will complete a series of algebra problems as a distractor. This makes this a delayed recall task, not immediate, as the testing portion, where they're asked to recall the words, is not occurring immediately after the study portion, where they're presented the words. Rather, there's a distractor in between. Participants after the distractor are then asked to remember as many words as possible from the previous list in any order. The order is not important here, which makes this a free recall experiment where subjects are free to recall in any order. But the target list is. What I mean by a target list is that very preceding list. We're only asking participants to remember items from the list they just saw, not any before. So the most important thing here is the session structure. So we have 24 sessions where participants come in on different days and complete the experiment. The first 23 sessions have the same overall word pool. So we're using the same words here, but they're constructed in different lists and then presented in a scrambled order. So while you're going to see the same words for the first 23 sessions, they're all going to be grouped into different lists, and you're going to see them in different order grouped with different words preceding and different words following. The last session takes half of those words that have now built up repeated exposure and intermixes them with a set of entirely new words. So now in the final session, you're being asked to recall words that you've seen for the first time as opposed to the ones that you have repeated exposure to. So what are the results? We see that familiar words are better recalled on average. So in the final session. So what you'll remember if we go into the context of our prior example, you'll probably remember more details about your brother Frank than your cousin Nick if I asked you overall. However, the novel words are better discriminated, and what I mean by that is that there are fewer errors. So sometimes participants make mistakes and recall words that were not actually in that preceding target list. Maybe they recall a word that was presented 5 lists ago or 10 lists ago. You see more errors of that kind in the familiar words than the novel words. So what that means in our example is that you probably remember what you do remember about cousin Nick will almost certainly be from the last time you saw him and not from any other encounter. In contrast, you might remember details about your brother Frank from 2, 5, 10 meetings ago. Maybe you're thinking of 2 Christmases ago instead of last Christmas. That's very common here. Additionally, we find that novel words initiate recall sessions more often. So you're more likely to start with a detail about cousin Nick than brother Frank. We also see that the repeated exposure words that we took out to intermix the novel words in the final session are still activated, and some participants still recall them in that final session, even though they weren't presented. So recalling information about your brother Frank might make you actually recall information about your sister Ellen as well, even though you weren't asked about her at all. So what does this mean? We see here that multiple contexts yield trade-offs, even in the long-term sense across these multiple sessions. So you have a greater likelihood of recalling familiar information because there are so many experiences to draw on, but your precision is muddied because there's so much to choose from, and all of it's interfering with each other. Distinct contexts in opposition here bring greater attention to detail, but those details are less well supported, so you'll probably bring them up less often. So what we see here is that the effects of word familiarity on free recall are confirmed in these multi-session experiments with new long-term effects to show in terms of this novel recall initiation and the excluded words being activated. We're currently updating our models of human memory in the lab to account for the multi-session effects, and hopefully will contribute a better understanding of how humans organize and interpret their experiences. Thank you.